There is a country in the far eastern reaches of the world where the mountains come down to meet the sea in long, slow lines of green, where the forests are so quiet in certain hours that you can hear the wind move through a single leaf and know its name. It is a country that has been, for most of its long history, turned inward, watching itself, listening to itself, building its civilizations not outward toward conquest, but inward toward refinement. And in the 12th century, in a period so culturally rich and so politically fragile that it seems almost designed to shatter, that country began to tear itself apart. This is not a story about a single war. Wars, if you listen to them closely enough, are never really about the moment the first arrow flies. They are about everything that came before: the slow accumulation of grievances, the quiet shifting of loyalties, the way power moves like water through a landscape, filling the lowest places first, and then, when there is nowhere left to go, rising. This is a story about how a civilization built on beauty and ritual and the careful management of appearances arrived, over the course of decades, at a place where none of those things could save it. And about the men and women who lived inside that arrival, who made it, who suffered it, and who in the end became something larger than themselves because of it. The war is called the Genpei War. It lasted 5 years, from 1180 to 1185. It was fought between two great warrior houses, the Taira and the Minamoto, and it ended with one of them destroyed and the other forever changed. But the war itself is only part of the story. The deeper story is about what Japan was before it began, and what Japan became after it ended. It is about the nature of power and legitimacy, and the strange, quiet ways in which civilizations decide, without ever quite making the decision consciously, that something must change. So let us begin not with the war, but with the world that made it possible. Let us begin with the stillness. Japan, in the middle of the 12th century, was governed in name, at least by an emperor. The emperor resided in Kyoto, a city that had been the imperial capital for over 300 years. The court there was extraordinary. It was a place of extraordinary refinement of poetry composed by moonlight, of ceremonies conducted with a precision that bordered on the sacred, of a aesthetic sensibility so developed, so attuned to the textures of beauty and impermanence, that it had become, in many ways, a civilization unto itself. The people of the Heian court did not simply live in culture, they breathed it. They spoke it. They understood the world through it in ways that had almost nothing to do with the practical business of governing a country. And that, in a sense, was the problem. Or not a problem, exactly not yet. More like a drift. A slow, almost imperceptible movement away from the center of things. Because, while the court in Kyoto was composing poems and conducting rituals and managing the delicate choreography of imperial politics, real power, the kind of power that could raise armies, control land, move goods across the sea, was moving somewhere else entirely. It was moving outward, into the provinces, into the hands of men who wore armor instead of silk robes, who measured wealth in rice paddies and warriors rather than in the elegance of their calligraphy. These men were the samurai, and in the 12th century they were not yet the legendary figures they would become in later centuries. They were something perhaps more interesting, something more human. They were provincial lords, warriors, landholders, men whose identities were bound up in the land they controlled and the loyalty they commanded from the men who served them. They were proud. They were often brilliant, and they were, increasingly, aware that the court in Kyoto, for all its beauty, was not governing them. It was simply, quietly, becoming irrelevant. The culture of the Heian court deserves a moment of attention, because it is one of the things that makes the story of the Genpei War so strange and so resonant. It was not merely a culture of governance. It was a culture of feeling of an almost total immersion in the aesthetic and emotional textures of the world. The poets of the Heian court wrote verses about the color of autumn leaves and the sound of rain on a temple roof, and the way grief felt in the chest on a morning when the mist was particularly thick. These were not idle pastimes. They were, in the world of the court, serious exercises in the perception of beauty, the cultivation of sensitivity, the refinement of the self into something capable of noticing what most people did not notice. Buddhism, too, was woven into the fabric of court life, not as a distant doctrine, but as a lived experience, a way of understanding the world that shaped everything from the architecture of the temples to the way people thought about death and change and the passage of time. The monks at the great temples of Kyoto and Nara were not simply religious figures. They were, in many ways, the keepers of the country's intellectual and moral life, the men who asked the deepest questions about the nature of existence and who tried, in their own ways, to answer them. And their teachings, particularly the teachings about impermanence, about the transience of all worldly things, about the suffering that came from clinging to what could not be held, these teachings seeped into every corner of Japanese culture, shaping the way people experienced beauty and power and loss. It is important to understand this world, to feel its textures, its rhythms, its quiet preoccupation with the beauty of things that pass, because it is the world that the Genpei War would destroy. Or, not destroy, exactly, transform. The court did not disappear after the war. The poetry continued to be written. The rituals continued to be performed. But the world in which they had meaning, the world in which the emperor's authority was real and the court's refinement was the highest form of civilization that world was, after 1185, something different, something smaller, something that had been pushed to the margins by a new kind of power, a rougher and more direct kind, that had no patience for the subtleties of feeling and no interest in the beauty of autumn leaves. Into this world of drifting power and fading ceremony, two families had risen above the rest. Two warrior houses that had, over generations, accumulated influence, military strength, and something rarer and more dangerous than either, reputation. Their names were the Taira and the Minamoto. And the story of Japan in the 12th century is in large part the story of what happened when those two names came into conflict. But that conflict did not begin with a battle. It began, as most conflicts do, with a series of smaller things, with marriages and appointments and the quiet, patient accumulation of advantage, with the slow, almost invisible process by which one family rises and another is pushed down, and with the particular way in which the people who are pushed down do not disappear. They wait. Let us talk about the Taira first, because they are the ones who, for a time, seem to have won everything. The Taira clan, and when we speak of them, we speak most often of one man. Taira no Kiyomori rose to dominance in the 1150s and 1160s, in the aftermath of two earlier conflicts that had reshaped the balance of power in Japan. The Hogan Rebellion of 1156 and the Heiji Rebellion of 1159 were, in many ways, dress rehearsals for the Genpei War, smaller, shorter conflicts in which warrior families fought for influence at the imperial court. The Taira emerged from both of these struggles as the clear winners. Kiyomori, in particular, proved himself to be not merely a capable warrior, but a shrewd political mind. He understood, in a way that many of his contemporaries did not, that military victory was only the beginning. The real work, the harder work, was what came after. And so Kiyomori set about consolidating his family's position with a thoroughness that was, by the standards of his time, almost unprecedented. He placed Taira men in key military governorships throughout the country. He arranged marriages between his family and the imperial line itself, so that by the early 1170s, the emperor on the throne was, in effect, a Taira emperor. He controlled the trade routes along the Seto Inland Sea, the great waterway that connected the western and central parts of Japan, and through which a significant portion of the country's wealth flowed. Rice, timber, salt, silk, these things, moved through Taira-controlled waters, and the Taira took their share. Kiyomori was, in short, everywhere. His family's reach extended into almost every corner of Japanese politics and economics. And for a brief, bright, precarious time, this seemed like a permanent arrangement. The Taira were Japan's dominant force, and the court in Kyoto was, in many respects, their court. But there is a pattern in history that repeats itself so often it has almost become invisible, and it is this. The more completely a family or a dynasty or a system consolidates its power, the more completely it cuts itself off from the people it depends on for that power. Kiyomori's great achievement, bringing the Taira into the very center of imperial politics, was also, though he could not yet see it, his great mistake. Because in moving so thoroughly into the world of the court, the Taira were moving away from the world of the provinces, away from the samurai, away from the men whose swords and loyalty were the foundation on which all of their power ultimately rested. This is the way certain kinds of power work. It is like a man climbing a mountain. As he rises, the view becomes wider, more impressive, more commanding, but the ground beneath him becomes thinner. And at some point, not all at once, but gradually, imperceptibly, the ground begins to give way. The Taira, in the 1170s, were very high on the mountain, and somewhere below them, in the provinces, in the quiet places where the court's influence barely reached, another family was waiting. A family that had every reason to have disappeared and had not. A family whose name still carried weight, still stirred something in the hearts of provincial warriors, still whispered of a power that had been suppressed but never destroyed. The Minamoto. To understand the Minamoto's position in the 1170s, you have to understand what had happened to them in the decades before. The Minamoto had been, at one point, the Tairas equals a great warrior house with its own traditions, its own territories, its own proud history. But in the conflicts of the 1150s and 1160s, the same conflicts that had elevated the Taira the Minamoto had been on the losing side. And Kiyomori, who was many things but not foolish, had understood that a defeated rival, left intact, was a rival that could rise again. So he had moved against the Minamoto with a deliberate, systematic thoroughness. Minamoto men were executed. Others were exiled, sent to distant provinces, stripped of their positions, cut off from the networks of influence and patronage that sustained power in Japan. The Minamoto, in short, were dismantled. Piece by piece, family member by family member, they were taken apart and scattered. And yet, there is a particular kind of resilience that comes not from strength, but from patience. From the willingness to wait in the dark for as long as necessary until the conditions change. The Minamoto were scattered, yes, but they were not forgotten. Their name still meant something in the provinces among the warriors. The reputation of a great family is not something that can be executed or exiled. It persists. It lives in the memory of men who have heard stories, who have inherited loyalties, who have grown up knowing that a certain name once meant something and might, someday, mean something again. And among the scattered survivors of the Minamoto, there were two in particular who would, in time, become the center of everything. Two boys, really, at the time of the Heiji Rebellion, sons of Minamoto no Yoshitomo, who had been killed in that conflict. They were young enough, both of them, that Kiyomori had not seen them as threats worth eliminating. One was perhaps 10 years old. The other was perhaps 5 or 6. Too young to fight. Too young, it seemed, to matter. Their names were Yoritomo and Yoshitsune. And the story of the Genpei War is, in many ways, the story of what happened to them. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let us stay in the stillness. Let us remain in the world as it was before the storm, a world in which the Taira seemed secure. The court in Kyoto continued its rituals and its ceremonies, and the provinces went about their business in the long, quiet shadow of imperial authority. A world in which, if you stood in a temple garden in Kyoto and listened, you might hear nothing but the sound of water moving over stones, and the distant murmur of monks at prayer, and the wind in the maple trees, and think that nothing at all was about to change. The geography of Japan in this period is important to understand because it shaped everything that would follow. Japan is a country of islands, a long, narrow archipelago stretching from north to south along the eastern edge of Asia. The main islands are mountainous, forested, and separated from one another by narrow straits and channels of water. This geography meant that Japan was, in many respects, a collection of small, semi-autonomous regions, connected by sea routes and by the thin threads of imperial authority that ran from Kyoto outward into the provinces. Kyoto itself sat in the center of the largest island, Honshu, in a broad valley surrounded by mountain. It was a place of great beauty and great political weight, the seat of the emperor, the center of culture, the place where decisions were made and alliances were formed, and the future of the country was, in theory, determined. But Kyoto was also, increasingly, a place that was losing touch with the rest of Japan. The provinces, the regions beyond the mountains, beyond the immediate reach of the court, were developing their own cultures, their own economies, their own systems of power, and the sea routes that connected them, the channels and straits and open waters that allowed goods and people and information to move across the archipelago, were becoming, in many ways, more important than any road or any palace. The Seto Inland Sea, in particular, was a highway of enormous economic significance. It was the waterway that connected the western provinces, where some of the country's most productive rice lands lay, to the central regions where Kyoto stood. Whoever controlled the Seto Inland Sea controlled a significant portion of Japan's wealth, and in the 1170s, that waterway was controlled by the Taira. This is worth remembering, because it means that the Genpei War was not simply a conflict between two warrior families. It was, among other things, a conflict over economics, over the flow of wealth, the control of trade, the material foundations on which power ultimately rested. The banners that would be raised in the coming years, red for the Taira, white for the Minamoto, were not merely symbols of identity. They were, in a very real sense, flags planted over territory, over resources, over the physical substance of a civilization. But all of that is still to come. For now, the banners are not yet raised. The war is not yet declared. The world is still, for the moment, at peace, or something close enough to peace that it is difficult to tell the difference. The court poets are still composing their verses. The temple bells are still ringing at dawn. The water is still moving, quietly, through the inland sea. And somewhere, in the provinces, in the quiet places where exile had sent them, two boys are growing up. One is learning to be patient, the other is learning to be fast. And neither of them knows, yet, what that will mean. There is a particular kind of silence that comes not from the absence of noise, but from the presence of something too large to speak about directly. It is the silence of a room in which everyone knows what is happening, but no one has yet said the word. It is the silence of a country in which the ground is shifting, slowly beneath the feet of everyone who lives on it, and no one has yet felt the tremor. Japan, in the late 1170s, was living in that silence. The Taira were still in power. Kiyomori was still the dominant force in Japanese politics. The court in Kyoto was still functioning still conducting its rituals, still maintaining the appearance of stability and order. But beneath that appearance, beneath the surface of things, something had begun to move. A slow, quiet rearrangement of the forces that held the country together. A gathering of grievances that had no single origin and no single voice, but that were, nonetheless, converging toward something. Toward a question that could not be asked politely, and that, once asked, could not be put back. The question was this: who, in fact, had the right to govern Japan? It sounds like a simple question. It is not. In a country with an emperor, a figure who was, in the religious and cultural imagination of the people, something close to divine, the answer should have been obvious. The emperor governed. Everyone else served. But by the 1170s, this answer had become, in practice, almost meaningless. The emperor on the throne was a child Kiyomori's grandson, placed there through marriage and political arrangement, not through any independent claim to authority. The real decisions were being made by Kiyomori and his family, and the provincial lords, the warriors, the men whose swords and loyalty were the foundation of actual power, they were beginning to ask, quietly among themselves, whether this arrangement was one they were willing to accept indefinitely. Peace, after all, is not a state of nature. It is a decision. It is made, consciously or unconsciously, by the people who benefit from it. And when the costs of maintaining peace, the concessions, the subordinations, the quiet swallowing of pride, become greater than the costs of disrupting it, the decision changes, not all at once, not with a single dramatic gesture, but gradually, person by person, lord by lord, the calculus shifts, and at some point, without anyone having quite intended it, the war begins. The man who is often credited with igniting the Genpei War was not a warrior at all. He was a prince, Prince Mochihito, a son of the retired emperor Go Shirakawa. Mochihito was not, by temperament or by training, a revolutionary, but he was a prince with a grievance, and he had a father who was, by any measure, one of the most politically dangerous men in Japan. Go Shirakawa had been emperor once, briefly, and had spent the decades since his abdication engaged in a kind of continuous, restless political maneuvering that had earned him a reputation as a man who could not be trusted, not because he was dishonest, exactly, but because he was always calculating, always adjusting, always looking for the advantage that would keep him relevant. By 1180, Go Shirakawa was effectively a prisoner of the Taira, confined to his palace, his movements and communications monitored, his influence carefully curtailed. He was, in other words, a man with every reason to want the Taira's power broken. It was in this context that Prince Mochihito, in the summer of 1180, issued what is known as his call to arms, a declaration that the Taira were acting illegitimately, that they had seized power through force rather than right, and that any warrior who wished to restore the proper order of things was invited to take up arms against them. The declaration was, on its surface, a legal and religious document, an appeal to the authority of the imperial line, wrapped in the language of Buddhist righteousness. But beneath that language, it was something else entirely. It was a signal, a permission, a quiet, formal acknowledgement that the silence was over, and that anyone who had been waiting for a reason to act now had one. The declaration did not, in itself, start the war. Wars are not started by declarations. They are started by decisions by men, in specific places, with specific grievances and specific calculations of risk, deciding that the moment has come. But Mochihito's call to arms provided something that those men had been lacking, a framework, a story in which their rebellion was not mere self-interest, but something larger, a restoration of right, a defense of legitimacy, a sacred duty. This is how rebellions work in almost every civilization and every era. They do not begin with ideology, they begin with grievance, with the slow, grinding accumulation of small indignities and large resentments, and they are sustained, given shape, given narrative, given the weight of meaning, by a story that transforms personal anger into collective purpose. Mochihito's declaration was that story. It was the frame in which the coming war would be understood not as a power struggle between two families, but as a cosmic battle between right and wrong, between legitimate authority and illegitimate usurpation. And the man who moved first to answer that call the man who, more than anyone else, would shape what the war became, was not a prince, and not a monk, and not a court politician. He was a man in exile, in a small province on the eastern coast of Japan, who had spent most of his life waiting for exactly this moment. His name was Minamoto no Yoritomo, and he was, at the time of Mochihito's declaration, 22 years old. Yoritomo's story, up to this point, was not a story of glory or of grand adventure. It was a story of survival. He had been a child, perhaps 10 years old, when his father, Minamoto no Yoshitomo, had been killed in the Heiji Rebellion of 1159. He had been spared by Kiyomori, a decision that historians have debated ever since, because it seems, in retrospect, to have been one of the most consequential acts of mercy in Japanese history. Kiyomori could have killed the boy. In the political logic of the time, he probably should have, but he did not. Perhaps he saw no threat in a child. Perhaps he was moved by something else, by pity, or by a calculation that sparing the boy would cost him nothing and might, some day, earn him something. Whatever the reason, Yoritomo lived, and he was sent into exile to Izu province on the eastern coast, where he spent the next 20 years growing up in relative obscurity, far from the court, far from power, far from everything, except the memory of what his family had been. That memory was everything. It was the thread that connected him to the past, to the Minamoto name, to the network of loyalties and obligations that had sustained his family for generations. And it was, in a sense, the only real asset he had. He had no army, he had no territory, he had no position at court. What he had was a name and the weight that name still carried among the warriors of the eastern provinces, where the Minamoto had once been strong. Yoritomo understood this. More than that, he understood how to use it, because Yoritomo was not, primarily, a military man. He was a political one. His first moves, after Mochihito's declaration, were not military at all. They were alliances, marriages, promises. He went to the provincial lords of the East men, who had their own grievances against the Taira, their own reasons for wanting change, and he offered them something that no one else could offer, a story in which their rebellion was not merely justified, but necessary. He offered them the Minamoto name, and with it the legitimacy that name carried. He offered them autonomy, the right to govern their own lands, to manage their own affairs, free from the suffocating reach of Taira appointees. And he offered them, most importantly, the sense that they were not acting alone, that they were part of something larger, that the tide, which had been moving against them for years, was beginning to turn. It was a remarkable piece of political work, and it was, in many ways, more important than anything that would happen on the battlefield, because wars in the end are not won by swords alone. They are won by the ability to make other people believe that your cause is worth fighting for. And Yoritomo, in the summer of 1180, was already very good at that. There was, however, another figure in the Minamoto story, a younger figure, less patient, less political, and in many ways more extraordinary. A man who would, in the coming years, prove himself to be one of the most gifted military commanders Japan had ever produced, and who would, in the end, be destroyed by the very success he made possible. His name was Yoshitsune. He was Yoritomo's younger half-brother. They shared the same father but had different mothers, and he was, at the time of the war's beginning, perhaps 17 or 18 years old. Where Yoritomo was careful, Yoshitsune was bold. Where Yoritomo calculated, Yoshitsune acted. Where Yoritomo built alliances and managed appearances, Yoshitsune fought quickly, brilliantly, with an instinctive grasp of the battlefield that seemed almost to bypass the need for planning entirely. The two brothers were, in many ways, perfectly complementary. Yoritomo was the mind of the rebellion, Yoshitsune was its sword. And for a bright, brief, extraordinary time they worked together, each doing what he did best, and the Minamoto cause advanced because of them both. But complementary is not the same as compatible. And the difference between these two men, the patient builder and the brilliant fighter, the politician and the warrior, was a difference that would, in time, become the war's deepest wound. Not a wound inflicted by the enemy, but one opened from within. We will come to that wound later. For now, let us simply note that it existed, that from the very beginning, in the very structure of the Minamoto's leadership, there was a tension that the war itself would not resolve, that the war would, in fact, make worse. But all of that is still ahead. For now, what matters is this. By the summer and autumn of 1180, the rebellion was real. It had a name, the Minamoto cause. It had a leader, Yoritomo, building his power base in the east. It had a symbol, the white banner of the Minamoto, raised for the first time in a generation, clean and stark, against the green of the eastern mountains. And it had, for the first time, a counterpart. Because the Taira, who had been the dominant force in Japan for 2 decades, had raised their own banner in response. A banner that was deep and imperial and unmistakable, red. These colours, red and white, would come to define the war in ways that went far beyond their literal meaning. They were not chosen arbitrarily. In Japanese culture, colours carried weight. Red was the colour of authority, of the imperial court, of power that claimed to be legitimate and ancient. White was the colour of mourning, yes, but also of purity, of new beginnings, of a cause that presented itself as something clean and necessary, rising against something corrupt and overripe. The choice of these colours was deliberate, it was political, it was, in a sense, the first and most visible act of propaganda that each side committed. Red and white, Taira and Minamoto. The two banners facing each other across the landscape of Japan, and between them the slow, gathering weight of everything that was about to happen. The Taira, to their credit, did not immediately dismiss the rebellion as insignificant. Kiyomori, who was, by 1180, already ill, already weakened by the fevers and ailments that would kill him within a year, recognized that the situation was serious. But his response was slower than it might have been, and less decisive. This was not, necessarily, incompetence. It was the natural response of a man who had been dominant for so long that the idea of being seriously challenged had become almost abstract. There is a psychological phenomenon that historians and strategists have noted across many civilizations and many eras, the tendency of entrenched power to underestimate opposition, not because it is unintelligent, but because the very nature of dominance creates a kind of cognitive buffer against the possibility of defeat. You have been powerful for so long that power feels like the natural state of things. Challenges come and go. They always have. Why should this one be any different? The Taira asked themselves this question in various forms throughout 1180. And for a time, it seemed like a reasonable question. The Minamoto's rebellion was concentrated in the eastern provinces. The Taira still controlled the centre, the west, the court, the sea routes. The war, if it was a war at all, and some in the Taira camp were not yet willing to call it, that seemed like a provincial disturbance, important but manageable. They were wrong. but the wrongness would take time to become apparent. And in the meantime, the rebellion continued to grow, person by person, lord by lord, province by province, in the quiet way that rebellions grow when no one is paying close enough attention to stop them. There is a way in which the early stages of a civil war resemble the early stages of a disease. The symptoms are there, if you know where to look. A fever here, a weakness there, a slight discoloration of the skin, but they are easy to mistake for something else, for a passing illness, for a bad season, for one of the 100 small afflictions that any body, any civilization, must endure in the course of its life. It is only when the disease has taken hold, when it has spread beyond the point where it can be contained by any single intervention, that it becomes undeniable. And by then, the time for simple remedies has passed. Kiyomori died in the spring of 1181. He died of a fever, a burning, consuming illness that, according to the chronicles, was so fierce that his body seemed to radiate heat like a furnace. It is a vivid image, and perhaps a fitting one. Kiyomori had been, for 2 decades, the fire at the center of Japanese politics. And when he went out, the warmth he had provided, the stability, the coherence, the sense that someone at least knew what was happening and what to do about it went with him. His successors were capable men, many of them. But they were not Kiyomori. They lacked his vision, his decisiveness, his ability to hold a complex political situation in his mind and act on it before anyone else had fully understood it. And they were, increasingly, on the defensive, responding to Minamoto moves, rather than initiating their own. The Taira, in the years after Kiyomori's death, began to lose something that is, in warfare, almost as important as numbers or weapons. They began to lose the initiative, and the war, which had been, for a time, a quiet thing, a matter of alliances and declarations, and the slow marshalling of forces, began to become something else entirely, something louder, something that moved across the landscape of Japan with a speed and a force that no one, on either side, had quite anticipated. The war had begun. War does not begin with a single moment. It begins with 100 of them. A messenger arriving at a provincial lord's estate at dawn, carrying words that change everything. A sword being drawn from its scabbard for the first time in years, the metal still bright, the edge still true. A ship being loaded with rice and salt and weapons in a harbour that has been quiet for months. A man looking out at the mountains and knowing, without being told, that by the time the next moon rises, he will either be somewhere else entirely, or he will not be anywhere at all. These moments happened across Japan in the months of 1180. They happened quietly, individually, without any single one of them feeling like the beginning of anything. And then, all at once, they converged. And the war was not a possibility anymore. It was a fact, a living, moving, breathing fact that spread across the landscape of the country like water finding its way through cracks in stone. The Genpei War was not fought in one place. This is one of the first things to understand about it, and one of the things that makes it so difficult to tell as a simple story. It moved, it shifted. It had theatres and campaigns and engagements that were separated by hundreds of miles and by entirely different logics of geography and strategy. In the east, Yoritomo was consolidating his power, building his base at Kamakura, a small coastal town that would in time become the seat of Japan's first military government. In the west, around Kyoto and beyond, the Taira were fighting to maintain their hold on the center. And on the sea, on the great waterways that connected the islands and carried the wealth of the country from one end to the other, a naval contest was beginning that would, in the end, determine the outcome of everything. To understand the war, you have to understand all of these places at once. You have to hold them in your mind, the East and the West, the land and the sea, and see how they connected, how events in one place shaped events in another, how a decision made on a hillside in the provinces could ripple outward across the country and change the course of a battle fought weeks later on the other side of an ocean. It is in this way a war that resembles many wars throughout history. Wars are rarely simple. They are systems complex, interconnected, governed by their own internal logic. And the men and women who fight them are not simply executing a plan. They are improvising, adapting, responding to information that arrives late and incomplete, making decisions in conditions of uncertainty that would paralyze most of us, and living with the consequences in ways that no history book can fully capture. The first great engagement of the Genpei War, the one that gave the conflict its first real shape, its first real drama, took place at a bridge. A single bridge spanning a single river near the ancient capital of Nara, in the province that surrounded Kyoto itself. The place was called Uji, and the river was the Uji River, and the bridge that crossed it had, for generations, been one of the main routes between Nara and the capital. It was not a grand bridge. It was not, by any measure, a strategically vital choke point in the way that a mountain pass or a harbour might be. And yet, in the summer of 1180, it became the site of one of the war's earliest and most vivid engagements. The Minamoto forces, moving toward Kyoto from the east, needed to cross the Uji River to continue their advance. The Taira, aware of this, sent forces to defend the bridge, to hold it, to prevent the crossing, to buy time. What followed was a battle that was, by the standards of the Genpei War, relatively small. But it was also, in many ways, the war in miniature. It had everything: warriors fighting on a bridge, hand to hand, in the narrow space between the railings. Monks, Buddhist monks from the temple at Uji, armed with naganatas and bows, fighting alongside the warriors, their robes stained with river mud, their prayers interrupted by the sounds of combat. And, at a crucial moment, the Taira forces destroying the bridge itself, tearing it apart, section by section, to prevent the Minamoto from crossing, to turn the river into a barrier that could not be overcome. It did not work. The Minamoto found other ways across swimmers, boats, a ford upstream that the Taira had not thought to guard. The bridge was rebuilt, eventually, as bridges are. But the image of it, the monks and the warriors, the bridge being torn apart beneath their feet, the river running dark with mud and worse stayed. It became one of the war's most enduring images, one of the moments that the chroniclers and the storytellers would return to again and again in the years and centuries that followed, because it captured something true about what the war was, at its most basic level. A conflict fought not in the abstract, but in specific places, by specific people, in conditions that were messy and desperate and deeply, fundamentally human. The war expanded after Uji. It spread outward from Kyoto into the provinces, following the geography of Japan, the river valleys, the mountain passes, the coastal roads that connected one region to the next. And as it spread, it drew in more and more men. Lords who had been watching from a distance, calculating their risks, chose sides. Some chose the Taira. Some chose the Minamoto. Some waited and changed their minds, and changed them again, following the tide of fortune with a pragmatism that was, in the context of the time, entirely rational. Your family's survival depended on backing the winner. If the winner changed, you changed with it. This was not cowardice. It was the logic of a world in which the consequences of choosing wrong were not merely political, but existential. The economics of this choosing were more complex than they might appear at first glance. A provincial lord's decision to join one side or the other was not simply a matter of loyalty or ideology. It was a calculation, a weighing of costs and benefits that took into account the lord's own lands, his tenants, his debts, his relationships with neighboring lords, and the thousand other factors that shaped his daily life. War was expensive. It consumed resources, men, horses, weapons, food, at a rate that could, if it went on long enough, exhaust even a wealthy lord. And the rewards of victory were not guaranteed. A lord who backed the winning side might gain new territories, new privileges, new influence. Or he might gain nothing at all if the winners chose to reward their closest allies and ignore the rest. This meant that the war, as it moved across Japan, was not simply a contest of arms. It was a contest of persuasion, a continuous, evolving negotiation between the two sides and the men they needed to convince. Yoritomo understood this deeply. He was, among his many other talents, a gifted negotiator, a man who could read the needs and the fears of the men he was courting and offer them, with precision and with sincerity, exactly what they needed to hear. He promised autonomy. He promised recognition. He promised, most importantly, that the new order he was building would be one in which the provincial lords mattered, in which their voices would be heard, their territories respected, their dignity acknowledged in ways that the Taira court in Kyoto had never quite managed. And in the midst of this expanding, shifting, endlessly complicated conflict, one figure stood out, not because he was the most powerful, or the most politically astute, or the most strategically brilliant in the conventional sense, but because he was the fastest. Because he moved through the war with a speed and an audacity that seemed almost to defy the normal rules of how armies moved and how battles were planned and how generals operated. That figure was Yoshitsune. Minamoto no Yoshitsune was, by 1181 or 1182, barely 20 years old. He had grown up in relative obscurity, sent, like his brother Yoritomo, to a distant province after their father's death, raised in the shadow of a Buddhist temple, educated in the arts of warfare, and in the philosophical traditions that shaped the samurai's relationship to violence and to death. But where Yoritomo had used his years of exile to learn patience, to learn politics, to learn the slow, careful art of building alliances and managing appearances, Yoshitsune had learned something else entirely. He had learned to fight, and more than that, he had learned to fight in a way that was, for his time, genuinely original. Yoshitsune's campaigns in the western provinces, the campaigns that would, in the space of a few months, shift the balance of the war decisively in the Minamoto's favor, were not the work of a man following a plan. They were the work of a man who seemed to think faster than his opponents could react. He moved his forces with a speed that was, by the standards of 12th century warfare, almost shocking. He attacked when others would have waited. He committed forces when others would have held back. He took risks that horrified his more cautious commanders, risks that, in a different war, against a different enemy, might have been catastrophic. But in this war, against these opponents, they were not catastrophic. They were devastating. There is a way to understand what Yoshitsune was doing, a way that connects him not only to the specific conditions of the Genpei War, but to a pattern that has recurred across centuries and civilizations whenever a particular kind of military genius has appeared. It is the pattern of tempo, of speed as a weapon in itself. The idea that if you can move faster than your enemy expects, if you can act before they have time to react, to organize, to bring their own forces to bear, then you have already, in a sense, won the battle before it begins. Napoleon understood this. Wellington understood it in his own way. And Yoshitsune, in the western provinces of Japan, in the early 1180s, understood it with an instinctive clarity that seemed almost to bypass the need for formal understanding at all. The Taira, in the West, were not stupid. They were not poorly led, necessarily, but they were slow. They were reactive. They were fighting a war in which the initiative had passed to the other side, and they were unable or unwilling to seize it back. Every time they formed a plan, Yoshitsune had already moved. Every time they prepared a defense, he had already attacked somewhere else. It was like fighting a river. You could dam it in one place, but the water would simply find another way through, and it would always be moving downstream. And beneath all of this, beneath the campaigns and the engagements and the brilliant, dizzying movement of Yoshitsune's forces across the western landscape, there was another dimension to the war that was, in many ways, even more consequential. A dimension that played out not on the land, but on the water. On the sea, the Taira had always been a maritime power. Their control of the Seto Inland Sea had been one of the foundations of their dominance, a source of wealth, a highway for trade, and, in times of conflict, a means of projecting military power across vast distances. The Taira fleet was large, experienced, and, for much of the Genpei War, unchallenged. It was the Taira's greatest asset, and it was, for a time, their greatest source of confidence. Because as long as they controlled the sea, they controlled the flow of goods and supplies and reinforcements across the country. And as long as they controlled those flows, they could sustain themselves indefinitely, regardless of what was happening on the land. But the Minamoto understood this. Yoritomo understood it. Certainly he was, among many other things, a man who grasped the relationship between economics and military power with a clarity that few of his contemporaries could match. And so gradually, patiently, the Minamoto began to build their own naval capability. They recruited sailors and shipwrights. They gathered ships, some built from scratch, some captured from smaller lords along the coast. They learned the waters of the inland sea, its currents and its tides and its dangers. And they waited, as they had waited for so many things, for the moment when their navy would be strong enough to challenge the Taira at sea. That moment came in the spring of 1185. And when it came not gradually, but all at once, in a single engagement that would become one of the most consequential naval battles in the history of the world. But before we come to that battle, before we come to the water and the ships and the terrible, decisive confrontation at Dan no Ura, let us pause for a moment and think about what war does to the people who are caught inside it. Not the generals, not the lords who make the decisions, but the ordinary men, the warriors who fight, the farmers who are displaced, the monks who pray, the women and children who wait. War in 12th century Japan was not an abstraction. It was a physical, visceral, deeply personal experience. Men fought with swords and bows at close range, face to face. They rode horses into battle knowing that the horses might be killed beneath them, and that if they fell they might not rise again. They ate poorly, slept badly, travelled through weather and terrain that tested the limits of human endurance. And they did all of this in the knowledge, a knowledge that Buddhism, which permeated every aspect of Japanese culture, made unavoidable that death was not a distant possibility, but an immediate and ever-present one. The samurai of this period were not, in their own understanding, simply soldiers. They were men who had accepted, as a condition of their existence, the proximity of death. Buddhism taught impermanence, the idea that all things arise and pass away, that attachment to life was a form of suffering, and that the man who could release that attachment could face the world, including the world's violence, with a kind of clarity and calm that was, in itself, a form of spiritual achievement. This teaching did not make the samurai fearless. Exactly. Fear is a biological response, and no amount of philosophical reflection can entirely eliminate it. But it gave them a framework, a way of understanding their own vulnerability, their own mortality, that allowed them to function in conditions that would otherwise be unbearable. Mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. The knowledge that the cherry blossoms are beautiful precisely because they fall, that the moment is precious precisely because it passes, that life, in all its richness and all its pain, is a thing that exists for a time and then does not. This concept, this way of seeing, was not a footnote to the samurai's experience of war. It was, in many ways, the lens through which they experienced everything. The beauty of the world and the violence of the world were not, in their understanding, separate things. They were aspects of the same truth. And the man who could hold both of them in his mind at once, who could see the beauty and the violence, and understand them as parts of a single, coherent whole, was, in some sense, the man who was most fully alive. It is a way of thinking about war that is very different from the way we tend to think about it in the modern world. We tend to separate the beauty from the violence, to treat war as something ugly, something to be endured, something that exists in opposition to everything we value. The samurai of the Genpei War did not think this way. For them, war was not a departure from life, but an intensification of it. A place where the truth of things, the truth of time, of change, of mortality, was laid bare, in a way that ordinary life concealed. This does not make war beautiful. It does not make it good. It simply makes it, in the eyes of the men who fought it, something more complex than evil, something that deserved to be understood on its own terms, rather than simply condemned. The war continued through 1182 and 1183 and 1184, and as it continued, it deepened. It spread into regions that had been untouched. It drew in populations that had, until then, been bystanders. It consumed resources, food, labor, timber, iron, in quantities that put strain on the economy of the entire country. Famines occurred in some regions as the disruption of trade and agriculture took its toll. Communities were displaced, their homes burned, their fields left untended. The war was not simply a conflict between two families. It was, by this point, a transformation of the country itself, a remaking of the social and economic fabric of Japan, in ways that would take years, perhaps decades, to fully understand. And through all of this, the two banners continued to fly, red and white, Taira and Minamoto. They appeared at every engagement, every skirmish, every campaign on the hills above battlefields, on the masts of ships, in the hands of men riding toward each other across muddy plains and rocky coastlines. They were the war's most visible symbols, and they carried by now a weight of meaning that went far beyond their literal function as identifiers of allegiance. They had become, in the minds of the men who carried them, something almost sacred markers, not just of who you were fighting for, but of what you believed the world should be. The red banner said, "This is how things are. This is the order that has existed, and that must continue to exist." The white banner said, "This is how things must change. This is the order that is coming, whether the world is ready for it or not." And in the spring of 1185, the two banners met, for the last time, on the water. The Battle of Dan no Ura took place in the narrow strait between the islands of Honshu and Kyushu, at a place where the currents were strong and the tides shifted with a regularity that made the water itself a kind of clock. It was a naval engagement, a battle fought on ships, with archers firing across the water and warriors boarding enemy vessels and fighting hand-to-hand on decks that pitched and rolled with the movement of the sea. It was, by the standards of the time, a large battle. Both sides had committed significant forces. Both sides understood that this engagement, this particular meeting of ships and men and banners on this particular stretch of water, was likely to be decisive. The Taira fleet was powerful. It was experienced. Its sailors knew these waters, had sailed them for years, understood their moods and their dangers. And, It had the advantage of numbers: more ships, more men, more firepower in the conventional reckoning. By the logic of the battlefield, as it was understood at the time, the Taira should have won. They had every reason to believe they would. But there are things that cannot be predicted by counting ships and men. There are things that depend on smaller, more subtle factors, on the timing of the tide, on the decisions made in the first minutes of an engagement, on the mood of the men who are fighting, on the 1,000 invisible variables that turn the course of a battle in one direction or another. And on this particular day, in this particular strait, those variables aligned against the Taira in a way that no amount of preparation could have prevented. The battle turned, as many naval battles turn, on a single crucial shift in the flow of the fight. The accounts differ in their details, they always do, when the events are old and the storytelling has had centuries to shape them, but the broad outline is clear. The Minamoto forces, under Yoshitsune's command, attacked with a ferocity and a speed that the Taira had not fully anticipated. The tide, which had been favourable to the Taira in the early hours of the engagement, shifted as tides do, without warning or mercy, and suddenly the Taira ships were being pushed in directions their captains had not planned for. And the Minamoto, who had positioned their forces with a precise understanding of how the water moved in this strait, took advantage of the shift with a ruthlessness and an effectiveness that left the Taira with nowhere to go. The battle was over, in the end, relatively quickly. Not because it was small, but because once the tide turned, once the momentum shifted, once the Taira began to fall back, the collapse was rapid and complete. Ships were boarded. Crews were killed or surrendered. The red banners, which had been flying proudly at the start of the engagement, came down one by one across the water. And the Taira fleet, the fleet that had been the foundation of their power for a generation, the fleet that had carried their wealth and their authority across the inland sea, was destroyed. It was, in every meaningful sense, the end of the Taira as a political and military force in Japan. The war was not quite over. There would be smaller engagements, isolated pockets of resistance, the slow, grinding process of mopping up that follows any decisive victory. But the outcome was determined. The white banner had won. The red banner had fallen. And somewhere, in the chaos and the aftermath of Dan no Ura, in the wreckage of ships and the confusion of men trying to understand what had just happened, there was a moment, a single, terrible moment that would haunt Japan for centuries to come. There is a moment in the telling of any war when the story shifts. When the banners stop flying and the swords are put away and the dust begins to settle, and the question changes from who is winning to what has been lost. It is not always the most dramatic moment. It is not always the moment that historians focus on, or that chroniclers record in the greatest detail. But it is, often, the truest moment, the moment in which the real weight of the war becomes visible, not as a grand narrative of victory and defeat, but as a collection of individual griefs, quiet and specific, that no amount of celebration can fully acknowledge. The war at Dan no Ura was over. The Taira fleet was destroyed. The white banners of the Minamoto had prevailed, and the red banners of the Taira had been driven from the water. In the broad sweep of history, this was a decisive moment, the moment in which the balance of power in Japan shifted permanently from one family to another, from one era to the next. But before the historians could write their accounts, and before the chroniclers could compose their verses, there was this: a woman on a ship in the midst of chaos, making a decision that no one should ever have to make. Her name was Tokudaiji. She was the empress, the wife of the previous emperor, and the guardian, in this moment of crisis, of the young emperor Antoku. Antoku was 7 years old. He was a boy, a child really, who had been placed on the throne not because of anything he had done or chosen, but because of the political calculations of the adults around him. He was, in every meaningful sense, a pawn, a symbol, a piece on a board that other people were moving. When the battle turned against the Taira, when it became clear that the fleet was going to be destroyed, that there was no escape, that the Minamoto would take everything, the court, the throne, the future Tokudaiji faced a choice. She could allow the young emperor to be captured by the Minamoto. She could allow him to fall into the hands of men who had every reason to see him as a threat, as a rival claimant to the throne, as a loose end that needed to be dealt with. Or she could prevent that from happening. In the only way she could, she threw the emperor into the sea. It is a terrible image. It is one of the most haunting images in all of Japanese history, and it has been revisited, reimagined, mourned, and debated for 800 years. The chroniclers recorded it with a care and a gravity that suggest they understood, even at the time, that this moment was something more than a single event in a long war. It was a symbol, a crystallization of everything that the war had cost, not in terms of armies and territories and political power, but in terms of human life, human suffering, human loss. And with the emperor, something else was lost, something that had no military value whatsoever, but that carried, in the cultural and religious imagination of Japan, an almost incalculable weight. The imperial regalia, the three sacred objects that, according to tradition, had been passed down from the gods themselves to the first emperor of Japan: a mirror, a sword, a jewel. These objects were not simply valuable. They were not simply old. They were, in the mythology of the imperial line, the physical proof of the emperor's divine authority, the tangible connection between the throne and the heavens. And when Tokudaiji threw herself and the emperor and the regalia into the sea, she threw all of that with them. The mirror, tradition says, was recovered, fished from the water by divers, brought back to the surface, returned to the imperial treasury. The sword and the jewel were not recovered. They sank. They are, in the telling of the story, still there, somewhere in the waters of the strait, at Dan-no-ura, in the dark, among the wreckage of the ships, among the bones of the men who fought and died that day. They have never been found, and the loss of them, the permanent, irreplaceable loss, became one of the wounds in the body of Japanese civilization that would never fully heal, a wound that would be narrated over centuries in poems and in prayers and in stories, but that could never be closed. This is what victory looks like sometimes. Not triumph, not celebration, but loss, quiet, specific, irreversible loss that is visible only to those who know where to look. The war, in the months and years that followed Dan-no-ura, did not end cleanly. Wars rarely do. There were isolated engagements, scattered pockets of Taira resistance, the slow, unglamorous process of establishing control over territories that had been contested for years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Minamoto had won, and the man who had, more than anyone else, made that victory possible, the man who had built the rebellion, assembled the alliances, created the political and military structure that had carried the Minamoto cause from a handful of exiles in the eastern provinces to the dominant power in Japan, that man was now, for the first time in his life, in a position to shape the future. His name, of course, was Yoritomo, and what he did next was not simply celebrate his victory. It was something far more remarkable and far more consequential. He built a government. The Kamakura shogunate, established in 1185, in the small coastal town where Yoritomo had made his base, was, in the history of Japan, a genuinely revolutionary institution. It was the first military government in the country's history, not a court, not a bureau, not a collection of noble families jockeying for influence at the emperor's palace. A government, an organized, deliberate, institutional structure designed to govern the country through the authority of the warrior class, rather than through the authority of the imperial court. This was not an accident, it was a plan. Yoritomo had understood, from very early in the rebellion, that winning the war was not the same thing as holding power. That power, once won, had to be organized, institutionalized, made durable. He had seen what happened to men who won battles, but failed to build structures, how quickly their victories faded, how easily their authority was challenged, how the chaos of war could undo even the most brilliant military achievement if it was not followed by something stable and lasting. And so Yoritomo built. He created a system of governance centered on Kamakura, a system in which military authority was primary, in which the provincial lords answered to the shogun rather than to the court, and in which the emperor remained as a figure of ceremonial and religious significance, but no longer as the source of real political power. It was, in essence, a separation of authority legitimacy in one place, power in another, that would define Japanese politics for centuries to come. The relationship between the emperor and the shogun, the delicate, carefully managed coexistence of two kinds of authority, became one of the defining features of Japanese civilization. It was not a relationship that could be reduced to simple terms. It was not simply the case that one was strong and the other was weak, or that one ruled and the other was ignored. It was more complex than that, a relationship in which both parties understood their roles, and in which the emperor's authority, though it was not the authority of military or economic power, was nonetheless real and necessary and respected. The shogun needed the emperor's legitimacy. The emperor needed the shogun's protection. They depended on each other in a way that was fragile and precarious, and somehow remarkably durable. Yoritomo understood all of this. He managed it with a care and a subtlety that revealed, once again, the depth of his political intelligence. He did not humiliate the imperial court. He did not strip the emperor of his title or his ceremonies or his cultural authority. He simply, quietly, made it clear that the world had changed. That power now resided in Kamakura, not in Kyoto. That the future belonged to the warriors, not to the courtiers, and that anyone who wished to have influence in that future would need to understand the new rules and play by them. It was a masterful piece of political work, and it was, in many ways, Yoritomo's greatest achievement, greater even than the military victory that had made it possible. Because armies can be assembled and disbanded, battles can be won and lost, but institutions, real institutions, durable ones, ones that outlast the men who built them, are rare. They are the things that endure long after the banners have come down and the swords have been put away. And the institution that Yoritomo built at Kamakura would endure, in various forms, for nearly 700 years. But there is another story, a quieter story, a sadder one, that runs alongside Yoritomo's triumph. A story about the man who had made that triumph possible in the most immediate and most visceral sense. The man who had fought the battles, won the campaigns, moved his forces across the western provinces with a speed and a brilliance that had no equal in the entire war. The man whose military genius had been, in the end, the decisive factor in the Minamoto's victory. That man was Yoshitsune, and his story, after the war, was not a story of reward or recognition or the quiet enjoyment of a victory well earned. It was a story of destruction. The relationship between Yoritomo and Yoshitsune had always been complex. They were half-brothers sharing a father but not a mother, and separated for most of their childhood by distance and circumstance. They had come together for the war, united by a common cause, and by the shared blood that connected them, however thinly, to the Minamoto name. And during the war itself, they had worked together with a complementarity that was, in retrospect, almost miraculous. Yoritomo, the builder, the politician, the man who saw the long game. Yoshitsune, the fighter, the intuitive, the man who lived entirely in the present moment of the battlefield. But complementary is not the same as comfortable, and beneath the surface of their alliance there were tensions that the war had kept submerged, but that peace would not. Yoshitsune was brilliant, and he was beloved by his soldiers, by the people who had seen him fight, by the chroniclers who would, in the centuries to come, make him one of the most celebrated figures in Japanese history. His popularity was real, and it was vast. And Yoritomo, the careful, calculating, institutionally minded Yoritomo, saw that popularity for what it was, a threat. Not necessarily a conscious threat, not perhaps a threat that Yoshitsune himself intended or even understood, but a threat nonetheless. In a world in which power was still fragile, still newly established, still vulnerable to challenge from any quarter, the existence of a beloved military hero with his own following and his own reputation was, for a man like Yoritomo, an unacceptable risk. Not because Yoshitsune was plotting against him, but because, in the logic of power, the possibility of a plot was almost as dangerous as the plot itself. This is a pattern that has recurred throughout history, in almost every civilization where power has been contested. The men who win wars are often not the men who govern peacefully afterward. The qualities that make a great military commander boldness, impulsiveness, a willingness to act on instinct rather than on calculation, are precisely the qualities that make a dangerous subordinate in peacetime. And the men who build governments patient, suspicious, institutionally minded are, by their very nature, uncomfortable with men who cannot be controlled. Yoritomo began quietly to move against Yoshitsune. He did not act openly at first. He did not challenge his brother directly or accuse him publicly of disloyalty. Instead, he undermined him. He reduced his authority. He questioned his movements, his alliances, his decisions. He created, around Yoshitsune, a web of suspicion and surveillance that tightened gradually over months, until Yoshitsune found himself cut off from his troops, from his allies, from the networks of support that had sustained him during the war. Yoshitsune, to his credit, understood what was happening. He understood it with a clarity that suggests, perhaps, that he had always known, on some level, that this was how it would end. He was not a man who was suited to the world that Yoritomo was building. He was not patient. He was not institutional. He was not, fundamentally, a man who could operate within a system that required subordination and deference and the careful management of appearances. He was a man who fought, and when the fighting was over, he had nothing left. He fled. From Kamakura, from the coast, from the world of politics and power that had consumed him. He moved northward, into the provinces, carrying with him a small group of loyal companions, men who had fought with him during the war, who would not abandon him now, even though the cause for which they had fought was lost. He moved through the countryside like a ghost, seeking refuge, seeking allies, seeking some way to survive in a world that had, effectively, decided he was no longer welcome in it. But survival, for a man of Yoshitsune's reputation, was very difficult. Yoritomo's reach was long, his agents were everywhere, and the provincial lords, who had learned, during the war, the value of backing the winning side, were not inclined to shelter a man who was, by now, clearly on the losing side of a different kind of conflict. Yoshitsune was hunted, and he was caught, eventually, at a place called Hiraizumi, in the far northern provinces, a place that had been, in an earlier era, a seat of wealth and culture, and that had, by the time Yoshitsune arrived there, fallen into decline. The accounts of what happened at Hiraizumi differ, they always do, when the events are old and the emotions are raw. Some say that Yoshitsune killed himself in the manner that samurai were expected to end their lives when capture was imminent, a swift, deliberate act, performed with the same composure and the same acceptance of impermanence that Buddhism had taught him to value throughout his life. Others say that he was killed, that the end was not as dignified as the legends suggest, that death, even for the most celebrated warriors, was rarely as clean as the stories made it. Whatever the truth of it, Yoshitsune was dead. He was 29 years old. He had won a war that changed Japan. He had been destroyed by the man who had benefited most from that victory. And he had left behind, in the hearts and minds of the people who knew his story, a wound that would not close a sense of injustice, of tragedy, of a life that had been cut short, not by an enemy, but by the very system he had helped to create. It is tempting, when telling this story, to cast Yoritomo as the villain, the cold, calculating brother who destroyed the brilliant, beloved one. But that reading is too simple. Yoritomo was not evil. He was afraid. He was a man who had spent his entire life in the shadow of loss, the loss of his father, the loss of his family's position, the years of exile and uncertainty, and who had built, out of that loss, a system designed to prevent it from happening again. That system required control. It required the elimination of risk, and Yoshitsune, for all his brilliance, was an uncontrollable risk. This is the brutal logic of power, and it is not unique to Japan or to the 12th century. It is a logic that has repeated itself in different forms across every civilization that has ever built an empire or a dynasty or a government. The men who win the wars and the men who govern the peace are often different men, and the transition between the two, the moment in which the warrior gives way to the administrator, is often the bloodiest and the saddest part of the story. The Taira, for their part, did not disappear. They were scattered as they had been scattered before, driven from the centers of power, exiled to the margins, forced to rebuild their lives in remote provinces and on distant islands. Some of them survived. Some of them found new lives, new identities, new ways of being in a world that had changed around them. Traces of the Taira can still be found in certain corners of Japan, in family names and local traditions, and the quiet, persistent memory of a time when their banner flew high above the capital. The war had not destroyed them, it had dispersed them. And dispersal, as the Minamoto themselves had once learned, is not the same as destruction. And now, let us move forward. Not by days, or by months, or by the slow grinding passage of a war, but by something larger, by decades, by centuries, by the long, quiet accumulation of time that turns an event into a memory, and a memory into a story, and a story into something that lives permanently in the fabric of a civilization. The Genpei War ended in 1185. The Battle of Dan-no-Ura was fought, and the Taira were destroyed, and the Minamoto took power, and Japan began, slowly, to reorganize itself around the new order that Yoritomo had built at Kamakura. All of this happened, all of it was real, and all of it, in the years and decades and centuries that followed, was transformed gradually, inevitably, irrevocably into something that was no longer quite history, and no longer quite myth, but something in between, something that carried the weight of both, and that shaped the way Japan understood itself for generations to come. The most important vehicle for that transformation was a work of literature, a great, sprawling, deeply Buddhist narrative that has been called, by scholars and by readers alike, one of the masterpieces of Japanese writing. Its name is the Heian Monogatari, the Tale of the Heian, and it is not a history book in any sense that we would recognize. It is a long, immersive, deeply felt story about the rise and fall of the Taira clan, told not as a chronicle of political events, but as a meditation on the nature of power and fate and the impermanence of all things under heaven. The Heian Monogatari was not written by a single author or in a single sitting or at a single point in time. It was composed, compiled, revised, and reshaped over many decades, perhaps beginning within a generation of the war itself and continuing to evolve well into the 13th and 14th centuries. Different versions exist, and they differ from one another in significant ways. But the core of the work, its central vision, its fundamental understanding of what the Genpei War meant and why it mattered, remained consistent across all of them. That vision was Buddhist. It was shaped at every level by the teachings of impermanence that had been so central to the samurai's experience of the war itself. The Heike Monogatari did not present the Taira's fall as simply a military defeat or a political miscalculation. It presented it as something cosmological, as an illustration of the great truth that Buddhism had been teaching for centuries, that all things arise and all things pass away, and that the attachment to power, to beauty, to the things of this world is the source of all suffering. The Taira had been beautiful, they had been powerful, they had been, in many ways, magnificent, and they had fallen, not because they were evil, but because they were mortal, because everything mortal falls. This is a way of understanding history that is very different from the way we tend to understand it in the modern world. We tend to look for causes for specific decisions, specific mistakes, specific turning points that explain why one side won and the other lost. The Heike Monogatari was not interested in causes, exactly. It was interested in the shape of things, in the way that power rises and falls like the tide, not because of any single factor, but because that is what power does. That is what all things do. They rise, they shine, they fall. And in this telling, in this long, slow, magnificently sorrowful narrative of a civilization's decline, the Taira were not villains. They were tragic figures, beautiful, proud, doomed figures, whose greatness was inseparable from their vulnerability, whose power was inseparable from their eventual destruction. The Heike Monogatari mourned them, in a sense. It mourned them the way Buddhism mourns all things that have passed, not with bitterness and not with denial, but with a quiet, aching awareness that they were here, and that they were extraordinary, and that they are gone. It is a remarkable achievement, this work, this great monument of Japanese literature, and it is, in many ways, more consequential than the war itself, because the war happened once, in a specific time and a specific place, but the Heike Monogatari happened continuously, was read and performed and retold, for centuries shaping the way generations of Japanese people understood not only the Genpei War, but the nature of power itself. It became, in the deepest sense, a part of the country's soul. And alongside the Heike Monogatari, another story grew, a story about a single man, a single figure from the war who became, in the centuries after his death, one of the most mythologized, most beloved, most persistently fascinating figures in all of Japanese culture. Yoshitsune. In the years after his death at Hirezumi, Yoshitsune did not fade from memory. He intensified. He grew. He became, in the telling and the retelling and the endless reimagining of his story, something larger than any single man could ever be, a figure who carried, in his person, all of the things that the war had stirred in the hearts of the people who lived through it and the people who came after. He was the brilliant warrior who had been destroyed, the beloved brother who had been betrayed, the man who had saved Japan and been rewarded with death. Plays were written about him, poems were composed in his memory, legends accumulated around him like sediment around a stone in a river, layer upon layer of story, each one adding something, reshaping something, until the figure of Yoshitsune, in the popular imagination, was no longer entirely the historical man, but something else. An archetype, a symbol, a vessel for the emotions and the ideals that the war had stirred and that had never been fully resolved. In some of the legends, Yoshitsune did not die at Hirezumi at all. He escaped. He fled northward, westward, across the sea to distant lands where Yoritomo's reach could not follow him, to Manchuria, to Korea, to unknown places beyond the horizon where he lived out his life in exile and in obscurity, a ghost in the stories of a country he had once saved. These legends are not history. They are not meant to be history. They are something else entirely, a way of refusing to accept that a man like Yoshitsune could simply end. A way of keeping him alive in the imagination, because the alternative that he was simply gone, simply dead, simply finished, was too painful to bear. This is what civilizations do with their tragic heroes. They cannot let them go. They cannot accept that the story ended badly, that the brilliant man was wasted, that the system consumed the very person it needed most. So they rewrite the ending. They create alternative histories, parallel lives, escape routes that the historical record does not support, but that the emotional record demands. They keep the hero alive in story, because to let him die completely would be to admit something about the nature of power that no one wants to admit, that it does not reward greatness, that it rewards survival, and that the two are not always the same thing. Yoritomo, for his part, is remembered differently. Not as a villain, the chroniclers were not, in the main, unkind to him, but as something colder than a villain. Something more complicated. He is remembered as the man who built an empire, the man who created a system that lasted for centuries, the man who understood, better than almost anyone in Japanese history, the relationship between military power and political power, and who managed that relationship with a skill and a patience that was, in its own way, as remarkable as Yoshitsune's brilliance on the battlefield. But he is also remembered as the man who destroyed his brother. And that fact, that single, quiet, devastating fact, colors everything else about him, in the way that a single shadow can color an entire landscape. The Kamakura shogunate that Yoritomo built endured in various forms for nearly 700 years. The idea that military authority should be primary, that the shogun, not the emperor, should hold real power, became one of the organizing principles of Japanese civilization, lasting until the great upheaval of the 19th century, when the old order was finally swept away and Japan opened itself to the modern world. The Genpei War did not simply end a conflict, it inaugurated an era. It set in motion a pattern of governance that shaped everything that followed the wars of the 13th century, the invasions of the Mongols, the long civil wars of the 15th and 16th centuries, the eventual unification of Japan under a single military ruler. All of it grew, in one way or another, out of the ground that Yoritomo planted in 1185. And then there are the ghosts. In the folk traditions of Japan, in the stories that were told by fireside, in the whispered narratives that travelled from village to village along the coastal roads, the dead of the Genpei War did not rest. They haunted the shores of the inland sea. They appeared as storms, sudden and violent, rising out of clear skies without warning. They appeared as apparitions, figures seen in the mist, standing on the water, watching the living with eyes that held no anger but something worse, something like sorrow, something like recognition. The ghosts of the Taira, in these stories, were not evil spirits. They were not demons or monsters or creatures of malice. They were simply the dead men and women who had been caught in the machinery of history and had not survived it, and who lingered in the space between the living world and whatever lay beyond it, unable to move on, unable to forget, unable to stop watching the country they had once helped to build. These ghost stories are not footnotes to the history of the Genpei War. They are, in many ways, the history, or at least one version of it. They are the way a civilization processes its dead, holds them close, refuses to let them disappear entirely. They are a form of memory that is deeper than any chronicle or any scholarly account, a memory that lives in the body, in the blood, in the way a people understands its own past. When a fisherman on the inland sea feels the wind shift suddenly and thinks, for a moment, that he hears something in it, a voice, a drum, a sound that has no name, he is participating in a tradition that stretches back 800 years. He is, in a sense, still living inside the war. This is what wars do in the long run. They do not simply reshape the political and military landscape of a country. They reshape the way a people understands itself, its past, its present, its relationship to the dead, and to the future. The Genpei War reshaped Japan in ways that went far beyond the fall of the Taira and the rise of the Minamoto. It gave Japan a set of stories about power, about loss, about the nature of beauty and impermanence, and the strange, persistent relationship between the living and the dead that it has been telling itself ever since. The Heian Monogatari is one of those stories. The legends of Yoshitsune are another. The ghost stories of the haunted shores are a third. And behind all of them, beneath all of them, is the war itself, the real war, the one that was fought by real men in real places, with real swords and real ships and real banners flying against a real sky. The war that lasted 5 years and changed everything. The war that began with a prince's declaration and ended with an empress throwing an emperor into the sea. The war that made Japan what it became. We have travelled, in this telling, a long way, from the stillness of the Heian court to the chaos of the battlefield, from the quiet accumulation of grievances to the decisive clash of ships at Dan no Ura, from the brilliant doomed campaigns of Yoshitsune to the patient, ruthless institution building of Yoritomo, from the living world to the world of ghosts, and back again. We have seen how power moves, and how it fails, and how it rebuilds itself from the ruins of its own destruction. We have seen how civilizations remember their wars not as simple stories of victory and defeat, but as complex, layered, endlessly resonating narratives that carry meaning long after the last sword has been sheathed. And perhaps, if we have listened carefully, if we have paid attention not only to the events but to the way they felt, to the textures of the world in which they took place, to the quiet undercurrents of emotion and belief and cultural memory that ran beneath the surface of everything, perhaps we have understood something about the nature of the Genpei War that goes beyond its historical significance. Something about what it means to live in a world where beauty and violence coexist, where power is always in motion, where the dead do not disappear but simply change the way they are present. The Japanese have a word for this, mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the knowledge that all things pass, the cherry blossoms, the empires, the men who built them. It is not a sad word exactly. It is not a happy one. It is something in between, a way of seeing the world that holds both beauty and loss in the same breath, and finds, in that holding, not despair, but something closer to peace. The war is over, the banners have come down, the ships at Dan no Ura have long since rotted away, and the men who sailed them have been dust for 8 centuries. But the sea is still there. The inland sea, with its currents and its tides, its quiet mornings and its sudden storms, its long stretches of water that have carried goods and people and stories from one end of Japan to the other for as long as anyone can remember. It is still there, moving as it has always moved, as it will always move. And somewhere beneath it, in the dark, in the deep, in the place where the water meets the silence, the swords and the jewels and the banners and the bones are still resting, still waiting, still, in their own quiet way, part of the story. The water moves on, as it always has, as it always will, and the story continues in the way that all stories continue, not with an ending exactly, but with a silence, a long, deep, patient silence, in which everything that has been said settles, slowly, into the stillness from which it came.